I've talked extensively on this channel about how get-rich-quick advice just isn't for me. There are multiple reasons for this. A lot of the advice givers are being disingenuous and are mostly trying to get themselves rich quick. But in addition to that, I personally try to never be in a hurry if I can help it. I'll talk about some ways that plays out in my life and some strategies that I use. But first I want to talk about why I try never to hurry and why Dune, the sci-fi classic, got it right. So I want to start out with a quote from one of my favorite books, a book by Richard Carlson called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. I'll read it to y'all. Let go of the idea that gentle, relaxed people can't be superachievers. One of the major reasons so many of us remain hurried, frightened, and competitive and continue to live life as if it were one giant emergency is our fear that if we were to become more peaceful and loving, we would suddenly stop achieving our goals. We would become lazy and apathetic. You could put this fear to rest by realizing that the opposite is actually true. Fearful, frantic thinking takes an enormous amount of energy and drains the creativity and motivation from our lives. When you are fearful or frantic, you literally immobilize yourself from your greatest potential. Not to mention enjoyment. Any success that you do have is despite your fear, not because of it. So that's the quote. Another way to put it, as they say in Dune, is fear is the mind killer. It's paradoxical, but absolutely true. The more you push yourself and stress and you hurry, the harder it is to actually think and to think rationally and clearly. You're wasting all this energy on stress and pushing yourself that you could be using to stay focused and solve problems. You know, it's good to be determined and keep your eye on the prize. Hurrying, though, is very cognitively expensive, and you don't have to take my word for it. There's research on the subject. What they found is that there is an optimal level of stress. So it's good to be awake, aware, focused, a little get up and go. That will improve performance. But they have found that if you are too stressed, if those levels of stress get too high, it makes you way less productive. You can't think, you can't problem solve. This is very cognitively expensive, and especially when you're doing creative work, and making YouTube videos certainly counts as creative work. You need all of your mental and emotional resources. So I hear what you're saying. Paige, I'm really busy. And it's actually funny because sometimes I tell people that, rushing makes you less productive. And they say to me, well, that's not gonna work if you're really busy. You probably did that at a time when you had all the time in the world where you were free to kind of do that. The reality is that it isn't true. And let me tell you a little story about it. So when I first found this quote, this idea of slowing down, this gentle, relaxed, superachiever idea, found me at a really difficult time in my life. At the time, I was working the job from hell, and I had a commute that ranged from 45 minutes to 2 hours each way, depending on the traffic that day. I was working overtime, and I had just started a new business. It's the business that today, 7 years later, supports me. But back then, it was just another thing I was balancing, and a lot of people in my life were like, oh, yeah, sure, that's gonna take off. During this stressful time, I was getting up at 5 a.m. every day and going to bed at 11 o'clock at night. And I was working and busy the whole time. A lot of times I'd actually do intermittent fasting, and I wouldn't eat till dinner time, and I would work on my business during my lunch break as well. So I was straight out between day job, commutes, domestic responsibilities, and the new business. And at the time, I was revising my first book, and I was also posting an essay online every single day to my blog, something I kept up for 5 years without missing a post, and how I built my audience initially back in the day. I was doing all of this while working overtime and commuting. I'll tell you, the day job was stressful enough. I loved my job, but I hated the people I worked for. And I had many days where I was miserable, exhausted, and stressed to the max. And about that time, a bunch of positive things entered my life by chance. And one of those was stumbling upon this passage about gentle, relaxed superachievers. I had a lot to do, yeah, I really had a lot to do. I needed to stay on task, but I had this epiphany that thinking hurrying thoughts and rushing, and stressing myself out, having those stressed, hurried emotions, wasn't actually helping me. I thought it was, but I took a deep look at myself and my life, and I experimented with trying to enjoy myself whenever I could, even in this storm of activity. At the time, I called it making my own fun. There are a lot of different things I did, but I laughed more, kind of using humor as a form of therapy, tried to look at the funny side of things. And I made a few changes in my life. I looked honestly at everything that I could delegate to somebody else, or perhaps do a slightly worse job on without any consequences. There were some things that I was really putting a lot of pressure on myself about that nobody cared about. I had just convinced myself that the only way to succeed was by caring about everything really hard and getting really stressed out and it wasn't. It was actually affecting me. I could feel it, that it over time was going to affect my health. And I can look back now and see that the quality of my work actually got better. But at the time, I convinced myself that I needed that to have high quality work. Anyway, I gave it a shot and I shifted. I started to think to myself, it's okay to be gentle and relaxed. You can still achieve a lot. Just reminding myself of this and laughing more and staying on task, staying disciplined, staying determined, but not torturing myself while I was doing it, not getting as keyed up. And I also started mindfulness practice, which is another thing that kind of came into my life. I had an employee that was a mindfulness trainer. He would do meditation. He taught me to meditate. He taught me to teach others to meditate. So that was helpful as well. But this reframe about being a gentle, relaxed superachiever really helped. And a funny thing happened. Once I started trying to chill out a little bit, I didn't do less. I actually did a lot more. I was able to keep going. I had a great book launch. All these years later, I have a great business. I powered through, I didn't burn out, and I have that attitude to thank for it. You know, it's like I said, the research says that a little stress is okay, but too much backfires. And frankly, I am a person who, just by the way I'm wired, has no problem reaching the minimum level of stress you need to actually function. Like, I'm good there. I'm never gonna have a stress deficiency. I instead have the issue where I get too hard on myself, I get too stressed. So I've committed to staying gentle and relaxed. So if you were like that, if you're the kind of person that is really hard on yourself and has that problem, you know, maybe you try an experiment of your own. So what kind of changes are we talking about? What does this look like? I can go into this more in some later videos because I feel like every technique has its own theory and praxis and its whole proper way of being implemented. And I have stories about everything as well. But just briefly, here are a few things, the rough overall points, the 80-20 of it, if you will. One of the big things I do is I schedule extra time around every task that I do. I never book myself to 100%. This actually confuses my best friend and my husband because they are both perfectionists, overachievers. By the way, I was raised by two perfectionist overachievers. I attract this type. I'm a recovering perfectionist myself, but this confuses people sometimes. I will book to 80%. I don't book to 100%. And there's a few reasons for this. One thing is that it gives me time to pursue things that I enjoy and to pursue continued personal and professional development, which is really important to me. It also means that if I'm wrong about how long I think things are going to take, I have a little slack time. And a lot of people are wrong about how long they think things are going to take. They call it the planning fallacy. So knowing about this, I build a little in there. And then the other thing that's really neat is if someone close to me, my perfectionist bestie, my perfectionist husband, my other friends, has a project that they need help with that they didn't budget any time for, which happens a lot with my perfectionist friends, I am actually available to leap in and help them, and I wouldn't be otherwise. And I think there's a huge value to being able to do that. Obviously, it's helpful to my loved ones, but to me as well. I get the satisfaction of helping people who need help. I mean, that's great. But in addition, I am nurturing my relationships with other people, and I think that is so helpful. It's so important for our well-being and our sense of connectedness, which is a big part of our happiness, to foster those social relationships and have the extra bandwidth to help people. And also, they're very willing to help me if I mess up and I end up overscheduled, even despite my best efforts. I have that network to help me. Actually, frankly, my friends are always begging me. They're always like, hey, is there anything I can help you with? They're always looking to help, which is really interesting. You know, I didn't have that before. I changed my whole paradigm in the way that I schedule. Another thing I had to do was get better at setting boundaries. Now, I could do a whole video on boundaries. I could do a whole series on boundaries. I could probably do a whole channel on setting boundaries because it is that complicated and that important, and it is very difficult for people to learn. But being able to say no is huge. Very briefly, there is something that one of my employees, one of the psychological trainers that worked for me back in the day, taught in one of her presentations that really stuck with me, and that is the following: yes equals no, and no equals yes. Now, what the heck does that mean? That's patently false, right? That's not how math works. That's not how consent works. But listen up, there's a method to this madness. This is about the interplay between boundary setting and opportunity. So every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. So if you say yes when you really don't want to do something, when it's not something that fulfills you, when it's not something meaningful to you, when it is this weird illusory ought to. I feel like I ought to do this, but you really don't have to. You have to go and say no to something else you would rather do. That's sad, right? And conversely, whenever you say no to something you don't want to do, you can say yes to something you would rather do. And that's why it's good to learn to say no to people, even if it's hard, even if you feel like a meanie. I've actually taught a lot on boundary setting and the research around it and strategies. So if you're interested in more videos on that, I can do some episodes on that. Let me know. And finally, I've alluded to this in this video, but letting go of perfectionism. Huge. Does that mean that I want to do a bad job and be a mess and be terrible at everything I ever do? No, of course not. But it's not all or nothing, and perfectionism convinces us that it is, that it's either perfect or terrible, it's black and white thinking. Instead, there's usually like a good balance in there where you're doing good enough, whether it's because this task isn't important or just for now. There's a good enough level for every task, for every situation, I promise you. Now, certain things you got to be pretty much perfect on. When they're sending a shuttle into space, that's going to be locked down tight. But there are so many times where it really doesn't matter, where you do your best and you don't worry and it's good enough. So I call myself a recovering perfectionist, which is kind of self-deprecating. I consider myself an optimizer. I optimize situations. So again, I could go a lot deeper into that, what that looks like, examples, how I made that shift, but that's the overview. It has been a really long and tough journey changing my ways, moving from the old way of thinking to the new way. I can tell you it has been worth every ounce of effort. It really changed my life. Anyway, it's been great talking to you as always. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.